event is about a really fascinating recent publication, Genesis, Truman, American Jews, and the Origins of the Arab-Israeli Conflict. Of course, we have copies available. We're very glad to have the author, John Judis, with us today, and I'm sure he'll be happy to put his signature on some of those copies afterwards as well. John is an American journalist, born in Chicago. He attended Amherst College and received a BA and MA in philosophy from the University of California at Berkeley. He is a senior editor at The New Republic and contributing editor to the American Prospect. He was a founding editor of Socialist Revolution, now it's called Socialist Review, in 1969, and of the East Bay Voice in the 1970s. He started reporting from Washington in 1982 when he became a founding editor and Washington correspondent for In These Times, a democratic socialist weekly magazine. He's written for a variety of publications and covers the Israeli-Palestinian question regularly for the New Republic, and of course the author of Genesis. So please join us in welcoming John to speak about Truman, American Jews, and the origins of the Arab-Israeli conflict.
You failed to mention that I used to be a contributing editor of GQ, and they used to always joke about my appearance. I did that for about 5 years. So I'm very happy to be here, and I'm going to talk for 35, 40 minutes maybe, and then open for questions. And I'm looking forward to you giving me a hard time, but a different hard time than I've usually been getting from audiences, which is on the mostly on the other side of the issues. So be at me. I'm happy to answer your questions. I am not a professional Israel watcher, and my connections to the Judaism as a religion are very tangential. I had no religious background. I became interested in Israel in the 1960s. In the mid-1960s, I was an anti-war protester, and it looked like what was happening over there was much better than what was happening in my country. And when the Six-Day War broke out, I called the consulate in San Francisco to volunteer, and they said, it's too late. We don't need you, because I think it was like 2 or 3 days into that war. After that, I began reading, and I remember particularly Maxim Rodinson, his work, Israel and the Arabs. That was very influential. It had a lot of influence on me, and as the occupation took hold, I began to rethink my own positions, and that was quite a while ago. But I've never been that involved with any particular organizations, pro or con. And at the New Republic, as you probably know, until very recently, the kinds of views that I had were not, you would not commonly find them in the magazine. And if I was going to write about it, I'd do it for somebody else. So I started this book in 2004, 2005. And I originally thought that I would write well, let me put it this way. A friend of mine, I was trying to decide what to do, and a friend said, well, why don't you write your position, take what your position is, take a strong position on what's happening now and what should happen. And I had two problems with that. The first was that I haven't been a journalist in the Middle East. I don't know a lot of I've had these interviews with leaders, but I don't know the terrain that well. But the second thing, which was more important, was that the debate in the United States about Israel and Palestine often takes the form of a kind of divorce disagreement, a he said, she said. Who was responsible for the Second Intifada? Who really screwed up Camp David? And I didn't want to get lodged in that particular debate. I didn't want to get stuck in that. So I thought, well, if I go backwards and look at the beginning in terms of American policy in the Truman years, that would provide a window into what happened subsequently, and it would be more difficult for people to dismiss my views as being based on, let's say, talking to the wrong people at the wrong time, because I was going to do a scholarly book, which I did. The only thing that I found in looking at the Truman years, and these were really the first years where an American administration was engaged with the issue, the only thing that I found was that if you just look from 1945 to 1950 or 1948 to what was happening and to the debate in the United States, the Holocaust just overshadows everything, and it overshadows it in a moral sense. It makes it very, very difficult to understand the Arab side of the debate, or why the Arabs were so angry at the time, and why they rejected the UN deal. And what I found was that in order to present what happened from 1945 to 1950, I had to go back to 1890. In effect, not to 200 BCE or something like that, because that's not. Then you get a whole different set of distortions, or to the Crusaders. No, but to about the 1890s, and to look at the origins of Zionism and Arab nationalism. And let me just say a few things that you probably already know about that, and then we'll work my way up to Truman. Zionism begins, there's Christian Zionists for a long time, but as a movement it begins in the Pale of Settlement outside of part of the Russian Empire, 1880s, 1890s, and it begins as a kind of national liberation movement for the Jews. The key event is Theodor Herzl in 1895, the Jewish state, the formation of the Zionist organization. And even from the beginning, there are really two sides. The one side of Zionism is as a national liberation movement, as a people who find themselves oppressed, persecuted, not simply as a religion, but as a separate nationality, but as a nationality without a nation. So the solution to that, it would seem to be, would be to have a nation. So they weren't seen as simply an alien nationality within Poland, within Austria, within Romania. So that's really the origins of Zionism as a political enterprise. The problem was that in settling on Palestine as a destination, as a place to have a nation, the Zionist movement was in effect going to colonize a place where another people already lived and had lived for 1,000 years. So, 1890, all the figures are in dispute, but I think a fair representation is about 500,000 there, 4% Jewish, 96% of which, it's about 5% Christian, 90% Muslim, Arab, but just an overwhelming majority, many of whom had lived since the 600 CE. A lot, could trace themselves back well before that. So the enterprise of Zionism had this problem at the core of it, which was to say that it planned to establish a state where other people lived. And that became especially acute after 1917, after the Balfour Declaration in December 1917, where the British, in effect, gave their imprimatur to the idea of establishing a Jewish homeland state, commonwealth, in Palestine, and when at the same time our president Woodrow Wilson and Lenin in the Soviet Union encouraged the idea of national self-determination for the formerly colonized people who, with the destruction of the Ottoman Empire in World War I, were suddenly put in a position where they could claim to have their own nationality. So really what you get in the early 1920s is the beginning of this clash between Zionism and a Palestinian Arab nationalism that persists to this day. I mean, 1921 to 2014, in terms of the basic clash, it's very similar to what's happening now. And as you know, the Palestinian Arab part of it has come out the loser. I've had several reviewers criticize me for saying in the conclusion of the book that the Palestinians got screwed. This was, I use the term as a vernacular in order to try to make the point and in order to try to get the reader's attention, which is to say that at the very end of this process, 120, 130 years after Zionism starts, you have a situation where there is a state of Israel, but where the Palestinian Arabs themselves not only don't have any state, but they're a colonized people and dispersed in various refugee camps. So that's, in that sense, yes, they got screwed. But what about Zionism, and what about the 1920s and 1930s, and what is the basis for supporting this enterprise, even though it has this dark side to it, establishing a state where other people lived? At the time, a lot of the justifications reflected the common imperial views of more advanced people coming in to help less advanced people. But there were two things that really changed internationally, the stature of Zionism and the moral urgency of it. The first was, what I'm going to say, which is the Nazis come to power in 1933, and not just the Nazis, but anti-Semitic parties, Central Europe, Eastern Europe, and even in France as well. So you had, beginning in 1933, this tremendous urgency about finding someplace else to go. At the same time, 1924, the United States closes off immigration, establishes quotas that are meant to discriminate not just against Jews, but against Southern Europeans, anybody who had started coming here in about 1880. If you look at the population figures, from 1880 to I think it's 1920 is when I got this figure. 2.5 million Jews emigrate from the Pale of Settlement, from Eastern Europe, those parts of Russia, to the United States. 30,000 go to Palestine. So, what I conclude from that is if the United States hadn't had those immigration quotas, if immigration had been as it had been before 1924, Israel would have been somewhere between Washington, D.C. and Scarsdale. In other words, there would have been a tremendous emigration to the United States, and the politics of the world would look a lot different. But that didn't happen, and instead what happened was that the Jews in Central Europe were increasingly squeezed, increasingly desperate, and saw Palestine as their only recourse. If you then look at the situation in about 1945 when Truman takes office, on the one hand you have the Jews wanting desperately to establish Palestine as a safe haven, as a place where other Jews were facing persecution. And at that point, nobody knew whether there wouldn't be Nazis in 1950 or 1955, as a place where Jews could emigrate and escape. That was part of the reality. The other part of the reality was that the Palestinian Arabs in the 1930s had fought this desperate battle, primarily against the British, and primarily directed at the British support for Zionism and for a Jewish state. And by 1945 or so, were on the one hand they had lost a lot of their leadership. A lot of what had been a political movement had become in a guerrilla movement. We describe them as the Palestinian population at the time, and some said dead set, envenomed against any compromise with the Jews, to the extent that the common proposal at the time was that Jewish, when they were having the negotiations in the end of the 1930s, when the British tried to make a deal, was that the Jews who had come before World War I were welcome. Those who had come afterwards, except for the children of ones who'd come before, were not welcome. So there was really no room for compromise at that point. The two sides were dead set against another. The Palestinians were dead set against any immigration. The Jews desperately wanted a state to which the persecuted Jews of Europe and those who remained from the Holocaust could emigrate. So Truman comes to office in April of 1945. Roosevelt dies. He does not have a great background on the issue. There's a kind of mythology that has arisen afterwards that's entirely false about him being a Christian Zionist since he was a child. He used to read the Bible because he was very nearsighted, and he didn't have glasses, and it had a big print. And what he particularly liked was the stories about the kings and things like that. I mean, it was not he was not like Woodrow Wilson or Lloyd George or Arthur Balfour, a Christian Zionist in that point, from that standpoint. His attitude was compounded of two things. His foreign policy was very much based on a moral outlook, on the idea that there were bullies in the world, there were underdogs, there were people that the bullies were taking advantage of, and he hated the Nazis. And if you read his speeches from the 1940s, he was not a great speaker. He was, fairly humdrum. I'd say Jimmy Carter would be an example of a similar speaking style. But I read one speech that he gave, and I think it was in 1943 or 1944, about the plight of the Jewish refugees. It must have been in 44 in Europe. That was totally from the heart, and showed just an intense anger against fascism and Nazis. So that was very important to his outlook. And he supported from the beginning the idea that the Jewish refugees in Europe should be allowed to go to Palestine. They should be allowed to emigrate, which the British themselves were very much against because they didn't want to provoke another 4 years of a war with the Arabs, and they were afraid that that's exactly what would happen if they allowed the concentration camp survivors and other people who feared to go to Palestine. That was one part of his outlook. But the other part of his outlook was that Truman was not a Zionist, contrary to the way he portrayed himself in the 50s and other people have portrayed him. He was very skeptical about the idea of either a Jewish state or an Arab state. His model as an American was multinational. He'd grown up in the South, in southern Missouri, in a place that had been torn apart by the Civil War, but that had finally reconciled. He had this view of America as a place where people could get, different races, religions could get along, and that was his ideal. So, morally speaking, the idea of a Jewish state or an Arab state was anathema to him. And when people began pressuring him about it, he would fight back. When the leaders of American Zionism came to visit him, he would say, "I'm sorry, I don't agree with that. That's not my position." The other aspect was that he was worried that if you had either a Jewish state or an Arab state, you'd have, he talked at the time, he used the phrase World War III, because he was worried that the Russians would intervene and we'd get caught up in a war. What he was basically worried about was he didn't want American forces to be involved in the Middle East. At the time, the Cold War was beginning, Europe. And he was worried that if he tried to force either a Jewish state or an Arab state, what you'd have would be, 40 years of war. Not that that's happened or anything like that, but but that's what he was worried about. So those two things were Truman's concern, both the moral issue of fairness and the issue of war. He early in his administration, 1945, 1946, he works with the British and with the Secretary Bevan, for the foreign secretary, and they establish a commission, the British American Commission. And they come up with a plan called the Morrison-Grady plan, and Morrison was the British guy and Grady was the State Department American guy who went over and who conferred with Truman regularly. And they come up with a plan in late July of 1946, which is as close as anything to what Truman wanted to see happen. And what it basically consisted of was, on the one hand, the British would allow 100,000 refugees to go to Palestine, and that was very important to him. On the other hand, you'd get a state that was neither Arab nor Jewish, that was binational or federated, modeled somewhat on Switzerland, where there would be a Jewish part, an Arab part, an internationalized part, where some mandated United Nations power would temporarily have control of foreign policy and higher financial concerns until such a time as that people could get together. But the basic idea was, again, a binational or federated state. And he gets ready to give a joint announcement with Clement Attlee, the British Prime Minister, of his support for that, and just all hell breaks loose. And what basically happens is that in America, in the after World War II and after the revelations about the final solution, the American Zionist movement, which would have been in the tens of thousands maybe at the most, becomes a large mass, powerful movement. 100,000, 200,000. It has at that point, which it never doesn't have now, a lot of voting power. It's not fundraising, but voting power, because New York is the most important state, the way California is now in elections. And the Jewish population in New York is a swing vote. Maryland, Ohio, Illinois, Pennsylvania, all those are important states. 1946 is a crucial election. The Democrats have had control of the House of Representatives since 1932. Their control is threatened. If the Republicans get in, they could basically repeal the New Deal. And the Democrats and Truman are worried to death that that could happen. The American Zionist movement at this point has a leader, Abba Hillel Silver, who understands lobbying and is a brilliant man in terms of American politics. And what he understands is that even though most Jews vote for Democrats and continue to vote for Democrats, what the lobby has to do is hold up the threat that they won't, that because of this single issue of establishing a Jewish commonwealth in Palestine, American Jews will vote for Republicans or vote, whatever. If the Republican is against it and the Democrats for it, they'll vote the Democrat, but this will be the single voting issue. Truman is scared to death of that, and there's a whole Henry Wallace, who's the Secretary of Commerce, describes this a meeting of the cabinet in late July, where Truman holds up this enormous stack of letters. And this was at a time when, now we have television and stuff, but if you get 2,000 letters from the state of Connecticut, a politician would start to worry. And so there were rallies all over the country. There were letter writing. There was pressure from Congress. And so Truman backs down and he gives up. And what happens at that point is a kind of, that Truman is known as the guy, the buck stops here. Do you know this about? He had this sign on his desk. And in terms of the Cold War, Berlin airlift and things like that, he was very much like that. In terms of Palestine, it was just the opposite. He was trying desperately to get other people to resolve it. He didn't want, at that point, August 1946, repeatedly tries to bow out of the issue. It flares up, it blows up. There's finally a battle between the State Department, the American Zionist, British, and he has to intervene. What he does when he intervenes is still try to reach a settlement, an agreement that's fair, that respects both the Arabs and the Jews. When you get to the United Nations in 1947, after the Zionist movement in Israel decides again brilliantly to accept partition, which the American Zionists were for an undivided Palestine. They wanted the whole thing, but the Ben Gurion, Nahum Goldman understood that was simply not a viable option. So what Truman does, though, in the United Nations is to try to reach some kind of an agreement, a proposal that reflects the populations. At that point, 70-30 Arab Jewish. The proposal that passes in November of Thanksgiving of that year is 56-40, with the rest internationalized Jewish 56-40. So it's almost a reversal of population and land. Truman and Marshall again try for something much closer to 50-50, or maybe even because the Arabs were going to get the Negev, it would have actually been a little more Arab than Jewish territory. But the same pattern happens. He backs down under pressure. And that's pretty much the pattern for the rest of his administration. He tries, after the 1948 war, for some kind of agreement on refugees. He tries for some kind of agreement on borders. Again, with the Negev, a big issue. But under pressure, he backs down. And, at this point, again, Truman is completely preoccupied with the Cold War. And then after that, Korea comes. So he doesn't give a great deal of attention to it. And when he gives attention, again, his first impulse is the same principles that guide him, but under pressure, he wilts. Now, the strange thing is that throughout this whole period, we're starting like late July of 1946, up through the recognition of Israel on May 15th, Truman never abandons his original idea of the Morrison-Grady plan. I found this very odd when I was going through his papers. Here, he recognizes Israel on May 14th, of 1948. On May 15th, he writes Bartley Crum. He says, "You, of course, are familiar with all the effort put forth by me to get a peaceable and satisfactory settlement of the Palestine question. I'm still hoping for just that. I think the report of the British-American Committee on Palestine was the correct solution, and I think eventually we are going to get it worked out just that way." 3 days later, he writes another person who had written him about the issue. And this is after he's recognized Israel. "My sole objective in the Palestine procedure has been to prevent bloodshed. The way things look today, we apparently have not been very, very successful. Nobody in this country has given the problem more time and thought than I have. In 1946, when the British-American Committee on Palestine was appointed and Mr. Bevan had made an agreement with me that he would accept the finding of that committee, I thought we had the problem solved. But the emotional Jews in the United States and the equal emotional Arabs in Egypt and Syria prevented that settlement from taking place." Just one more anecdote. So let's go 3 months later, September of 1948, a delegation from the Jewish war veterans comes to see Truman. And he thinks it's in the Oval Office, and he thinks it's going to be one of these ceremonial visits where they ask him to appear at their convention or something like that and give him some kind of an award or a letter, and they're off. But instead, the head of the Jewish war veterans reads him a list of demands related to the state of Israel, and Truman gets angry, and he says that he's the best friend the Jews had in America. And then he said that he and Bevan, quote, had agreed on the best possible solution for Palestine, and it was the Zionists who killed that plan by their opposition. So again, I'm just trying to say something more about Truman than what the ideal solution was, but that he, in his mind, he remained wedded to this idea, and I think that that you absolutely would not know that from most of the biographies that you read or from Truman's own memoirs in the 50s. And he changes his mind in 1950, 1951 after he becomes celebrated for recognizing Israel. But even afterwards, September 1948, he still thinks that the best plan would have been something completely different. Now, let me talk a minute about the plan itself. Would it have worked, and was it a viable solution in 1946, 47, 48? I'm not a determinist in terms of history. I mean, I don't think everything had to happen exactly as it happened. And if you look at that history, there were windows. There were very slight windows that were open. In August of 1946, there was a window for a kind of agreement, and Bevan was going to do it, and he had a heart attack. I mean, there was all these odd things happen, and so the British colonial secretary, who had a real tin ear, becomes the one in charge of negotiating with the Arab League, where there was some sympathy for a kind of compromise. But where they said the only way you're going to get a compromise is if we work it out privately. If you get this issue public, then we're going to have to take an absolute adamant stand against any agreement. But the colonial secretary, again, insists on doing it in public, and nothing comes of it. And, and there's a similar thing that happens in February, where Ben-Gurion worries suddenly that the issue is going to get thrown into the United Nations, where the Soviet Union, the Jews and the Americans mistakenly thought were going to be on the side of the Arabs, would outvote them, and they'd end up with something even worse. So in February, Ben-Gurion proposes some kind of an interim solution, which would involve a federation. But he's too late. By then, the British have already decided they're fed up. They want to get out of there, and they want to get out of there by 1948, and there's no compromise. So, given those two very slight windows, I'd say, for the most part, it's very hard to see that things could have happened other than they did. The only way in which Truman's solution, the Morrison-Grady plan, could have worked would have been if the United States had been willing to put troops on the ground to enforce the agreement, enforce the plan, to keep the sides apart, a kind of Kosovo, Bosnia kind of solution. I think it would be a good bet that it still wouldn't have worked, but in any case, the one thing that Truman absolutely did not want to do was to send any troops to the Middle East. This was the time of the Berlin airlift, and they were scared to death they were going to have to fight a land war on the European continent. So the United States really didn't have a viable option. And in that sense, if you look at that debate in late July, you had on the one hand an option that you had Truman pressing something that really was not going to work unless the Americans were willing to take the further step and put forces behind it, which they weren't. So what's to conclude from this? The thing I would conclude, the thing that I took from it, was that the principles that guided Truman and that led him to support Morrison Grady, and it led him to make this effort at the beginning, finally to give up, were valid. And those were, again, the idea that you needed to have a settlement there that was fair to both sides. And that meant fair to the Arabs as well as to the Jews. And secondly, that if you didn't get a settlement, you were going to have riot, rebellion, and war for decades and decades. So I think that those that those two guiding principles of Truman were right. But in terms of the application, I think flawed. And it's hard, for me to imagine a different kind of outcome. Now, what about the present? I used to, when I started talking about the book, I would usually end on a kind of hopeful note about Kerry's negotiations, and I guess I had the same problems as same kind of illusions that Truman had about Morrison and Grady, because wiser people than me knew that this was not going to work. I think we are in a very difficult situation. If you look at again, I think that it's hard to conceive of anything happening there between the Palestinians and the Jews in Israel and Palestine without outside pressure. I had a lot of hope that the EU would play a strong role, but the EU is crippled. It's really crippled by the Euro crisis, and I worry that it's even going to fall apart. So I don't think that it's a strong contender for an institution that would go in and exert a lot of pressure. United States, again, I think that I give Kerry credit for trying. But in order for him to have succeeded, you would have had to have at least two things. You would have had to have the president completely on board, which I don't think he was. I think that it was, again, something where they handed it off to Kerry as his thing and just watched it unfold and finally took some steps, but didn't put the president fully behind it. And secondly, in terms of fully behind it, the United States would have to use some muscle and some leverage. And I think it would have to use leverage primarily with the Israelis. Palestinians, as far as I can tell, the most moderate government, in my lifetime, certainly, and the one most amenable to compromise. Israeli government, I know there's some arguments that they're really left-wing because they believe in a two-state solution now, but I don't see it. I see them becoming more intransigent, increasing settlements, making any kind of two-state solution more and more difficult. And the only way, really, for the United States to have any effect would be to threaten aid. I don't see any other way to do it. And that's how George H.W. Bush got the Madrid conference in 1991. That's in effect what Clinton did at Wye River with Netanyahu. You have to be willing to get tough, and I don't think that the administration was willing to do that. Part of the problem, again, is the lobby in Washington. Though, in this particular negotiations, they really stood back. They didn't do much. Mostly preoccupied with Iran and not with the negotiations. I think they were probably smarter than me. They probably figured that nothing was going to come of it. But nonetheless, there is a continuing blind spot in terms of the lobby, and I'm speaking mainly of AIPAC and the conference. I'm not speaking of J Street or other Americans for Peace Now. Toward the Arab side of the question, and that goes back to early 20th century, and probably the part of the book that I'm most proud of because it's the most original, but that reviewers have paid least attention to, is the part on the history of American Zionism, because you get from the early 20th century a incredibly distorted view of Palestine as an unoccupied desert. That the Jews are coming to, population estimates that are just screwy, 2 times as many Jews as Arabs living there in 1910. I've gone through the Maccabean, I've gone through the literature, and even with the enlightened liberals like Louis Brandeis, you get comparisons between the Jews and the Arabs as between the Pilgrims and the Indians. would you get a kind of imperial mindset in viewing the situation. I mean, I was really surprised by this. Reinhold Niebuhr, you know who he is, famous American liberal, testifies in 1946 before this British-American committee is meeting in Washington, and he recommends the idea of transferring the Arabs to Iraq as a solution to the situation. So I'm just saying that on the liberal side, there's been this incredible blind spot, and it persists. And that's a problem in terms of resolving the conflict. I think that it's changing. It's changing among American Jews in particular. I think there's much less enchantment with Israel and with its government, and you would expect that given the history of the occupation and given the kind of government that's now in charge. But the donor community is still heavily weighted towards a position that just doesn't, in my view, take the Arab side seriously. So America, again, I don't see in the next 4 or 8 years any kind of serious push, and I don't see the EU, Israel moving again towards a more intransigent position. So I'm very pessimistic to conclude about what's going to happen there, and I'm afraid that the situation that I described in 1920 is just going to persist and get worse. Thank you.
Seville, D.C., when you mentioned that the other biographies and historical treatments that you saw about Truman and this era do not really pick up on his actual critical views of Zionism, do you think that was honest mistakes all the way by those who were writing those books, or do you feel that they're pro-Zionist, or maybe they didn't think it would sell books to start trashing Zionism or something? What's your sense of how that could be? I mean, you're a great historian, but there's some other ones out there, and they blew it, right?
Honest mistakes, and I probably exaggerated, because there are a lot. The funny, this is typical, that there are books by Israeli historians that are very accurate about Truman's views. Michael Cohen wrote a book, Truman in Israel. Zvi Gannon wrote another book. I think more what I'm talking about is the general view that you find in the United States, especially Clark Clifford's view of Truman. Clark Clifford was the key aide. You look at his memoirs. That's Truman's own memoirs. I think that's where you would find it. And some historians, there's a guy from Utah named Benson who wrote a book trying to show that Truman was a Christian Zionist. But I don't want to get down on all the historians.
Lady in the front row will come across.
Thank you. I hope I'm not asking of you a very simplistic answer, but when you say that the Palestinians were screwed, who exactly was it? Was it the Arabs? Was it the Jews? Was it the Americans? Was it the British? Was it the United Nations? Who were they screwed by?
Zionist, British particularly didn't get it. A lot goes back to 1917. The British by 1929 start to realize, maybe we made a mistake throwing these people together and trying to establish a homeland for the Jews here, but denying the Arabs even a legislature or anything. So Brits get a lot of blame for it. Especially if you go, I'm talking about before 1948.
Go in the back here.
Oh, sorry. I like to wander around.
Thank you, Yusuf. My name is Saeed Erikat. I wanted to ask, you took us on a journey on the origins with Truman and so on, and how the Jewish lobby evolved. I want you to look forward to the future. And how do you see this Jewish lobby is going where, considering that this problem seems to have no solution. It keeps hitting a brick wall.
Well, I tried to indicate a little of that at the end. If you, I'm, you probably know Peter Beinert's work. I think that his description of what's happening to American Jewry is pretty accurate. And what you get is not so much disenchantment, but disinterest. Disinterest, again, is not uninterest, but detachment from the issue. So I don't think that there is, again, there's not the I think J Street, for instance, which started out as a counter AIPAC that was going to be pro-peace, I think that they're having a good time now because they've been singled out for abuse by the Conference of American Jewish Presidents. You know what I'm talking about? They were denied, but I think they're going to have trouble because the people who are determined to support Israel, right or wrong, among the donor community outnumber those who really want to press for some kind of a settlement. And I think on the campuses and all this stuff, I just don't see the basis for any kind of strong movement that would push the United States into taking the kind of position that I described. So, in that sense, I'm pessimistic about the future.
Lady in the third row here. We'll get that side of the room.
Yes, I just wanted to find out if you've had any backlash from the Jewish community for your book, because I know I read Max Blumenfeld's book, and he's been shut out of every kind of discussion that I can try to find.
You know, I've known Max since he was 2 years old. I'm an old friend of his father's and mother's. So, I've had some very hostile reviews. Wall Street Journal, for instance, that accused me of condoning massacres and things like that. Just crazy stuff. And if you look on the web, I tried to write a response to it. And there was another organization, a Jewish museum in Washington, that invited me, then disinvited me, then invited me again. So I've had some backlash, but really nothing to compare to Walton Mersheimer or, some people in the past. I mean, it's nothing.
Bruce Wallman. One of the possibilities that I haven't finished the book, one of the possibilities in the 30s into the 40s was more immigration of Jews from or displaced persons to the United States or other places. In your research, did you find any serious possibility of that? Because as far as I understood, more of the displaced people would have rather come to the U.S. than to have come to Israel even in the late 40s.
Again, this is a really important part of the story that is often ignored. There was no support for changing the immigration quotas in the 30s. You have to remember that we had 25% unemployed in 1933. So it was a combination of whatever racism, anti-Semitism, and just, don't want people competing with jobs. And the Jewish organizations at the time, American Jewish Committee, Zionist Organization of America, were scared to broach the issue in Congress because they were worried that if they broached it, they'd get even more draconian restrictions. And in fact, that happened once or twice. It was only in 1948 where the refugees started to get let in the country.
Gentleman right here.
Brief statement and brief question.
Very brief, because we have a lot of
yes.
things we want to try to get to.
My father's entry into the port of Callao, Peru, 10 minutes before midnight, 1938, was denied because of the Zionist influence in the government of Peru. Otherwise, I wouldn't be here to tell you the story. Secondly, to ask you this question. Secondly, Miko Pellet, who was here, son of the general, Matty Pellet, advocated very articulately the one-state solution. It seems like Grady was a precursor to that, and you agree that this is the only realistic solution? Yes, it will evaporate the Jewish character of the state, but nevertheless, there will be peace and harmony.
I try to stay out of this stuff, but I'm not a one-state guy. I mean, I'm an American, so, in 50 years, that's the resolution. I think it's the best resolution for everybody. But my own feeling, and I don't want to sound condescending, is that the Palestinians need an experience at self-government, and that a two-state solution would be preferable. Whether it's viable or possible is a completely different question. And if the settlements continue, then really the only option is going to be a kind of civil rights strategy aimed at getting equal rights for everybody within this broader territory. But if you ask me what my idea was, it wouldn't be Morrison Grady.
Okay. The gentleman in the third row, you've been waiting very patiently over there.
Thank you. Just a comment. I'm Phil Schrafer, a retired social worker with international background. Comment is, as far as future peace agreements, there is a peace agreement being reached now in Mindanao in the Philippines between the Muslims and the Christian government. And I asked the Johns Hopkins professor how were they able to get to that point. And he said, basically, because both sides realized they couldn't win. Okay, enough comment. The question to you about Truman. A lot of people looked at FDR, whether he was prejudiced against Jews and so on and so forth. Apparently, he had Hans Morgenthau, and he had a number of other close advisors, and 15% of his appointments were Jewish in his first year. So could you comment on Truman and his relationship with American Jews?
Oh, there's a lot of evidence that Truman, as a young man, and to some extent as president, had certain kinds of prejudices against Jews. He hated Morgenthau, for instance, and if you look at his correspondence when he was from 18 to 25 years old or so, he complains about the Jews taking over New York, and all there were Jews and wops here. I have the quotes in my book. There's a lot of things like that. What I'd say about Truman is that he was he was prejudiced the way that a lot of Americans, including myself, are prejudiced against other groups. I grew up in Chicago, and I could tell you, I don't like the Irish, the Italian. So it was that kind of prejudice he had. It wasn't a racism. And in terms of his cabinet, he was very close to David Niles and Max Lowenthal. Those were two of his key advisors, and who influenced them a lot on Israel. Sam Rosenman came from Roosevelt to him. So I don't think he was prejudiced at all in any reasonable sense of the word.
Let's go right here, and then we'll go to the lady over here. This gentleman over here.
Hi. Remembering as a college student in that time, in the 40s, I remember that. Is it correct that the left was very critical of Truman? For example, Wallace felt he was not sufficiently pro-Israel. Is that your recollection as well? I don't remember that.
It's from reading, though, not.
Okay, but from what your research, okay,
The American left was very pro-Zionist. The Nation magazine played an enormous role in pressing the case for the state of Israel. Henry Wallace, I feel, was an opportunist on it. I once did a long essay on him, and I couldn't find the things, but he was more skeptical in the early 40s, and then when he started running, when the Progressive Party started running, they really made Truman into a Nazi. I have quotes again in my book of pamphlets that they put out trying to portray him as completely anti-Jewish and opposed to a state of Israel. So yes, the left was pretty much completely on the side of the state of a state of Israel.
was interested in what you knew about when and how the concept of Israel as a Jewish state came into being a tenet of U.S. policy. Did Truman have a role in that?
Truman had no role in that. I mean, I don't think Truman recognized, what was it called, de facto rather than de jure, where you didn't yet exchange ambassadors. And I think they crossed out something about Jewish state, and I can't remember the. Yes. So it's not. That was not. And Ben-Gurion himself would not have been in favor of that exact kind of formulation. They were publicly, vocally in favor of equal rights. So no, it didn't come about then. It's more. I don't know the history of it, but it starts about 10 years ago. It starts popping up.
Hi, I think you mentioned in your intro that you had an interest in philosophy. That was your beginnings with philosophy.
He
Yeah.
mentioned this,
Okay.
yes.
And so obviously you're somebody who was predisposed to really finding the truth, to have the idea of having a path, that you wouldn't just be glom onto one idea. No, I don't think I am. I guess my question is this. It's very interesting and obviously enlightening to hear what Truman really felt. I haven't read your book yet. That's a caveat. But I've also been reading how Einstein also, his legacy has sort of been twisted in this realm as well.
Right.
Also, the woman, Henrietta Zolda, who founded Hadassah.
Right.
Also, the fellow who founded Hebrew University. Many of these people believed in a binational state. And Einstein viewed a lot of the people who came up as leaders for Israel eventually as fascists. And I'm just wondering, what is the path for people like you who have something important to convey to the American public to get on the mainstream media? I mean, you've discussed some backlash and that sort of thing. What can be done to get you on MSNBC, Fox, CNN, all these outlets who should be invested in telling the truth, but somehow are ignoring a lot of these, the founding ideas, which ultimately harm everybody? Thank you.
Well, yes. Thanks, and if you want to do my publicity, I'm happy to. I've been, I've had reviews. The New York Times was pretty nice to me. They did an interview plus review plus on the editor's choice list. So I don't have those kind of complaints, and I try as a journalist usually to stay away from Fox because they set me up. So I thought you wanted to talk about the Magnus and Hannah Arendt and all these people. They're in my book. I describe them. Again, the surprising and depressing thing is how little support this group of people. There was an organization in the 1920s and then in the 1940s that comprised, again, Einstein, Hannah Arendt, Buber. Who was there was another, well, anyway, it's a lot of the cream of the Jewish intelligentsia, but they had almost no Arab support. I mean, really none. The Arabs, to some extent, didn't take them seriously because they thought that they were too idealistic. I have some material in my book about what happens at the Arab American Committee when they come to Jerusalem and hold hearings. And Judah Magnus, who is the guy from one of the founders of the Hebrew University, at that point the president of it, testifies and advocates the binational state. And I think it's Jamal Husseini, the cousin of the Mufti, interviewed afterwards by a journalist, says that we don't take these people seriously. So that's a depressing, but.
Gentleman here, we'll take one more after that. Just running over time.
I'm Tariq Basma from city of Tyre in southern Lebanon. And the city had been conquered by 18 different superpowers in the past. Now we have Israel as a neighbor. What do they think they're going to be there for a long time or not? I have no idea. Well, I lived there for 17 years, and I know those people have one thing that a lot of people don't have. They have patience, and they have time, the Arabs. And they count their years not in decades, they count them in centuries. I have 5 sisters, and we're trying to negotiate with them the land that we inherited. The problem, I can feel Truman's feeling when the Arabs are trying to negotiate. They don't know who they're negotiating with. Is it the Israelis, the Hebrews, the Jews, or the Semites, or the Zionists? It seems that whenever we sit down to talk to them, as if those people have 5 different heads and going in 5 different directions. So my question is, I can feel why Truman went back and forth on the subject matter, because he had no idea what those people are going to.
Good. I'm not going to talk about Truman, but I want to comment on what you said in the beginning. You know, when the Iraq War, when George W. Bush et al. Decided to invade Iraq, my position was that based on what had happened in Iran, you know, you go from 1953 to 1978 or 79, that even if they succeed, sooner or later, you know, there's going to be a comeuppance. But in that case, it took like 3 months or something like that. So yeah, people have memories. The fear, I think, is something that Arafat said in his last interview when he said, he said either I'm not or we are not Red Indians. You can get wiped out. Population can get wiped out, squeezed out. We'll see. I mean, sometimes force prevails in history, and you know, there's a danger of that. I wouldn't underestimate it. At the same time, you know, the strife is going to go on. So, you know.
We'll take one last question here, the young man sitting here.
Thank you. Michael Smith. I just want to thank you for coming out today. And I had a question. You mentioned earlier about that sort of Truman's efforts at playing the peacemaker were foiled by a couple of factors, one of them being sort of domestic political concerns and they could call it the proto-Israel lobby at that point.
Yeah.
And given how much stronger it seems now, some of these organizations, and just the affiliation and sort of the narrative within American society, do you think the U.S. can still exert any of the leverage it has over Israel, should it need to? Do you think it can still play that role, whether an administration wanted to completely or not? Or do you think maybe that moment's passed?
I got it. The Israel lobby then, 46, 47, 48, again in the wake of the revelations about the final solution, represented a coming together of all these organizations, a lot of which, like the American Jewish Committee, had been very skeptical about a Jewish state. The New York Times, all the major... It was a very powerful group. I'd say it was as powerful as anything is now. And if you look at the arc of history, it's very powerful, then sort of, you know, it starts to lose membership in the 1950s. 1967, 1973 are big spurts, and that's really, we're still living in the wake of that time. And I recommend this book by Peter Novak called The Holocaust in American Life, which is very, very important, understanding why there was this burst somewhat after the Six-Day War, but then especially after the Yom Kippur War, when Israel seemed survival seemed to be at stake. So it's, you know, it was as powerful then as it is now. Now, what's the second? There was a second part.
Whether or not you think that, given the strength of the lobby today, or as compared to what it was in the past, the U.S. government, even if an administration wanted to, would be able to exert the kind of pressure necessary to change Israeli
I think it'll exert pressure only if circumstances warrant in the Middle East. You know, if we got forced into a war with Iran in some way, I mean, I don't even want to discuss this possible scenarios, but you can think of what they are, a third intifada, something like that. But it would have to be something like that. It would have to be something where the United States suddenly felt it had to do something. I mean, you know, Obama doesn't think that he has to do anything about Syria, and that's just an incredible bloodbath going on over there. So that again, that's why I wish I used to be a revolutionary, and we used to always try to end on a optimistic note, you know. But I'm sorry, but I can't offer that today.
But you can get John's book, which is available. We'll have copies of that with plenty more about the story with Truman. And also, if we could get you to fill out the evaluation forms that you have, we'd really appreciate that. Thank you all again, and thank you, John.